Well, we're joined today by Brian Ballard. Brian is a philosophy professor at Loyola Marymount University and has a PhD in philosophy from the University of Pittsburgh. He also has a book forthcoming with Routledge titled The World as Relic. And that book explores the value of historical objects, the meaning of life, and the spiritual dimensions of nature. And you can visit Brian online at brianscottballard.com, which is also linked below. So, Brian, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks, Randall.
When I read the description of the world as relic, I was kind of taken off on a sidetrack, which I want to talk to you about before we get to the main topic of sort of faith and belief and hope. So let me set this up. And I may even, by setting this up, not be tracking at all with what you're arguing in the world as relic, because we haven't talked
Yeah,
about this, but that's just
right.
the nature of things. So about 12, 13 years ago, I published a book on heaven. And in there, one of the concepts I explored, which I don't think I've ever seen anywhere else discussed, was the idea that God values material objects and the objects of culture, and that part of the resurrection of a new creation might include the resurrection of historical objects. And they gave as a thought experiment God resurrecting the Titanic from the floor of the Atlantic because he values that as a material object and wants to see it sail again. That's my some of my own thoughts on the value of historical quote unquote objects. But even like yesterday, I or the 2 days ago, I picked up my motorcycle from the shop, probably had more money into it in terms of fixing it than maybe it's worth, but I have a lot of attachment to that as a material object, even though I could go out and get another motorcycle. Those are just some of my initial thoughts. What do
Hmm.
you mean when you talk about the value of historical objects?
Yeah, so I might mean something slightly different, but I do want to react to what you just said because I really like the idea that part of God's goodness to you in the life to come is that He might resurrect certain objects that you have an attachment to. And of course, we'll need some story about why that's the same thing and not a duplicate. But you need that story anyways about your own
Yeah,
body, so that's not like a
yeah,
special problem here.
fair.
Um, I quite like that thought. I'm sympathetic to a similar idea about the final things because um, I love this idea that like creation is unfinished, and one of the things that God is up to is He wants us to join Him as co-creators, and one of the ways we're co-creators is by engaging in creative projects. And so we don't bring those to perfection, or rarely we do in this life. So maybe one of the things God does for us that's redemptive in the life to come is He raises up some of those projects. I don't know, all of those projects. We have a long time after all, and
Yeah.
walks with us as we try to undertake them and bring them to the perfection that we really wanted here on Earth. I get that idea from Tolkien's short story called Leaf by Niggle. Sort of an unfortunate name, I have to say, but it's a good little short story, and it's got this powerful idea there, and I think that fits well with the idea you said. But I think your idea is slightly different, which is it's directly part of God's goodness to you to just raise up an attachment object. It's not necessarily about perfecting some project. So that's a cool thought. Do you want to react to that, or should I just launch into the world as relic?
No, no, I appreciate that. I mean, I would just go even further. It's not only that God values the object because we value it, but God values the object maybe in
Oh, yeah. Okay,
itself.
good. He's a valuer of value. So why wouldn't
Yeah,
he raise up the valuable thing and
yeah,
have it around? Yeah.
yeah. But
I
anyway,
like
yeah.
that.
So let's
Yeah.
segue to your thought.
Yeah, but the world as relic, it's a bit different. I'm in my own life, I love wilderness. I love engaging with nature. And I notice that many people do, and many people get a kind of spiritual significance out of that, whether you're a theist or not. For a lot of people, there's a spiritual dimension to hiking the range or watching the waves on the beach.
Hmm.
And if you're a theist, it seems like theists have a particular way of thinking about that spiritual dimension. And I sort of wanted to write a book that systematically explores that spiritual dimension. And you might think of it as a sort of a study in enchantment, how a theist can think about the enchantment of the natural world.
Hmm.
And I think the central insight is that there's a special kind of value that attaches to some objects because of their relations to persons and events outside of them. So imagine that an old sketch has been hanging on your wall for in your family for generations. It's been on your wall for years, and you don't know who the person is who made the sketch, but it's old and it's a beautiful, rough sketch of the human form. And then one day you discover your art historian friend conclusively confirms that it is indeed a lost page from Leonardo's notebooks. Well, what happens to your sense of the value of that sketch when you discover this? It seems to me like you've got a whole new way to value this. You value it more deeply. Now you're in awe of it. You admired it as a piece of art all along, but now it's like a precious relic. And that's because of its historical origin in the mind and the life of this great artist. Well, notice that that origin doesn't just enhance the value of the sketch, it also makes your life a bit more meaningful for having had the sketch in it. And notice as well that if God exists, the whole world has a sort of analogous origin in the most illustrious artist of all. And this would seem to give us a much deeper way of valuing the world that's around us. You can lift a stone from the earth and say, here is something made by God, something that began as a thought in the mind of God. And that seems to me to be a very enchanting sort of thought. And I just wanted to make that philosophically rigorous to make the sort of the joy of that available to reflective people.
That's excellent. Can I ask a couple things?
Yeah.
So I know we weren't going to talk about this, but
Hmm.
who knows? This is just in and of itself is intrinsically interesting to me. But so the first thought is I've often thought Antiques Roadshow was in some respects, a terrible program, the British and the American version, because it takes these amazing objects, but then everything builds toward what is its commercial value on a market of exchange, right? What is
Yeah.
its resale value,
Hmm.
its insurance value, its estimated value at auction, and it just kind of usurps out all of the value of what it meant to people in history and so on. And even if it comes from a quote unquote Da Vinci character, the market right now may be soft for the valuing that individual's work. So
Hmm.
it just it's seemed to me that it's just a very sort of reductionistic, materialistic way to think about material objects. So that's the one thought. The other one just is so here's a model for sort of valuing creation in an additional way because of the origin source of it. What do you think about the another very popular way of thinking about elevating the value of creation through panentheistic models of the God-world relation, where God is in fact somehow present within those material objects themselves. So, you value the river, the lake, the mountain, because these things actually are part of the body of God or the expression of God through materiality.
Yeah. I mean, it seems to me if that were true, that would certainly give you another deeper way to value. I mean, that would be a quite haunting, a kind of haunted joy to look at the world in that way. It's interesting, I've been thinking for years about this, and I just now picked up Thomas Traherne's Centuries of Meditations, and he's got this panentheist view in there, and he's pretty much said like almost every single thing that I say in this book, and it's a little bit humiliating. I feel like I'm just writing an elaborate footnote to Traherne, but yeah, so I haven't thought too deeply about whether I agree with that view, but I'm open to hearing more about it, and I think it would be a very enchanting way to. Certainly, if you have something analogous, if you have a certain kind of view about omnipresence, there's the old view about omnipresence that's just reducible to the fact that God is acting on every object and knows about every object. That's like what you find in some medievals. Well, that's a really like thinned out sense of omnipresence. But you probably know Hud Hudson, and
Yeah.
he's got this view where omnipresence is much more robust than that. It's God here between us right now as we talk, literally located completely in every point of space. And that's like, whoa, then you're swimming in God. And that seems to me like a similarly enchanted slash haunting slash disturbing, depending on how you feel about God, kind of view of the world.
Takes in him we live and move and have our being to another level, I
That's
guess.
right. Yeah,
Yeah.
right.
Okay. All right. Well, that's a taster. When is the book coming out?
Hopefully sometime in 2026, should the
Okay.
Lord tarry and all that. So,
Right. Okay. Well, we'll keep our eyes out for it, and we'll definitely have you back to talk about it when it does come out.
Well, thanks. I
Let's
appreciate that.
let's shift gears. Okay, so we're going to talk about faith and doubt and hope. And the genesis for this a little bit was you'd read my book, The Doubter's Creed, and had looked at
Hmm.
some things I talked about, and this initiated a conversation between us. So there we are, right there.
There it is. Look at that beauty.
So I'm going to I'll just synopsize some of my thoughts in The Doubter's Creed. Then you riff off that with your own particular take on hope, and we'll have a bit of conversation.
Okay, but before you do that, Randall, you got to
Yeah.
answer the question we're all wondering, which is this fella you there hiking the range?
No,
Okay,
no.
there you have it, folks.
I no my I have my friend Daryl has done all the covers for my books back to 2017. So he had the cover, but I do love, I mean, I haven't really climbed mountains in a while, like significant ones, but when I lived in Vancouver in the Lower Mainland, I was regularly doing the mountains around there, like
Hmm,
Golden Ears, Mount Garibaldi, the Lions,
hmm.
North Shore Mountains, beautiful
Oh,
part of the world. I'm far now from the mountains. I'm like 4 hours from the Rockies here in Alberta, but I
alas.
do love getting up the mountains.
Yeah. Yep. I'm with you.
I really sense that metaphor of God's cathedral when you're in mountain ranges and that. So
Hmm. Yeah.
okay. So here's some thoughts from the Doubters Creed. So I wrote that book for two basic groups of people. You should have an audience in mind when you're writing a book. Sadly, I don't always, and sometimes I find out after the fact there is no audience. But in this case, the audience, at least theoretically, was people who are identifying as Christians but have doubts, and people who want to identify as Christians but find they cannot believe. And the problem there is you can't will belief, and Christianity, as historically understood, demands a fair amount in terms of belief. It's famously a religion of creeds. So, how do you overcome that problem, that chasm often between belief and desire? So, part of my approach was to say, well, let's start off with what we can do. In fact, um, if I think about the Serenity Prayer, God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Let's start with what we can change. So for me, the heart of Christianity, according to Jesus himself, it seems, is to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And a second thing I would say is, well, your neighbor is the imago Dei, the image of God for you. So even to love God begins with the love of neighbor, who is the presence of God in your midst as the imago Dei. So here's a question to that group of people, or the two groups of people. How about you just begin the journey of Christian faith not by worrying about what you can make yourself believe, but rather what acts can I do to begin to love my neighbor in a very concrete way? And then through my neighbor, to begin to love God. And from there, I just build on that to say, well, these are the additional things you can do. Then I argue the concept of God in its minimal essence. You can begin with something transcendent, like a source of transcendent goodness and meaning that is beyond nature, and say that is the focus now of my love of God, and begin to orient your life toward the love of neighbor, and then toward that transcendent concept of a love of God and your love toward that being. And then on from there, participate in a Christian community, recognize that community can share your doubts. And from there, you can just begin to work into the degree of Christian participation to which you are able. And I don't think, honestly, if God is a perfectly loving, merciful God, that God is going to censure people for being unable to do things, right? If they physically cannot stand up, he's not going to judge them for failing to stand up when he enters the room, so to speak. And just do what you can. So that's the basic idea behind the Doubter's Creed. That's a little different than your approach. So tell us about your approach.
Yeah. Um, so one thing I love about your approach is that, and I'm going to summarize this. You can tell me if this doesn't sound quite right to you, but um, you say, look, I understand you can't believe this, but let me tell you the closest thing to it that you can believe. And in doing that, you're locating the doubter on a continuum. So whereas he might have experienced himself as facing a wall between him and the Christian life, Now he sees a path leading into the Christian life, and he sees I'm on it somewhere. And I just think that's a really powerful, it's a really powerful sort of conceptual shift for someone. And and the approach I have is different, but it's completely compatible. And it's, I think after I lay it out, it's worth thinking about how someone could, with total plausibility, take up both approaches in their life. And that, I think that illustrates the fact that these are just two different sort of tools. So on my approach, it's not, instead of saying, hey, here's what you can't believe this, here's what you can believe, whereby belief, what I'm thinking of is a mental state of assenting to a proposition or a claim. So sometimes when you're out in the street with your friends, you say, "Oh, I truly believe," and then it's some political doctrine or some heartfelt religious conviction. And that's not what I mean here. I just mean like looking at, considering some proposition, saying, "Yep, that's true." So I can believe in that sense that I have hands, or that the sky is blue. Any old trivial thing I can believe. Okay, and so um, my thought is, can we imagine a way of taking up the Christian life that doesn't rest on that kind of belief, but that instead rests on a hope? We hope for things all the time that are awash in uncertainty for us. And so the analogy I like is that of Penelope from the Odyssey. If you guys remember that, Penelope is Odysseus's wife, and Odysseus has been gone for many, many years, and yet she clings to the hope that one day he'll return. Okay, does she know he's going to return? No. Does she even believe it? Well, if she did, it'd be sort of unreasonable. I mean, her evidence certainly doesn't seem to suggest that he's going to return. It seems to leave it open, even leaves it unlikely. And yet she clings tenaciously to that hope. And this is expressed in the ways that she puts off the suitors who are trying to marry her, for example. And I've often thought we could actually flesh out her perspective. Like there's a novel to be written, I think, from Penelope's point of view, where we could imagine her rising every day to go out and brush Odysseus's favorite horse as a symbolic ritual act of declaring to herself that he's still out there. We could imagine her spending some evenings, watching the waves on the beach and allowing her fantasy life to be drawn into the thought that his sails might appear at any moment on the rim of the horizon. And you could flesh out this perspective. What you're imagining there is someone who, on the basis of a hope, is structuring her life so that she's aligned with that hope. Now, she can't do anything to bring it about that he comes back, but she can ready herself for that eventuality, and she can symbolically and ritually align herself with the goodness that that prospect holds out for her. And so my thought is like, that'd be a way of taking up the Christian life. Suppose you're someone outside the church who's, like many people, a spiritually curious agnostic. You say, look, there's probably something out there. I'm not sure about the claims of any particular religion. In fact, I'm quite skeptical, but who knows? And yet I can see that the Christian story would be really beautiful if it were true. I mean, some versions of the Christian story, For example, if you're a Christian universalist, you think that in the fullness of time, God succeeds in drawing every single heart to himself and in healing every broken creature. I mean, who wouldn't want that? So you might be arrested by the beauty that prospect holds out, unable to believe that it will happen, but perfectly able to hope. And if you knew that actually you could take up the Christian life, you could start going to mass, you could start going to Bible study, and you could pray to the God that you're not sure is out there, just as Penelope can stuff messages in a bottle and cast them out to the sea. Maybe the Christian life could be like that. So that's sort of my model of how a doubting person could enter in or maintain faith from inside the church. And interestingly different than Randall's, but as I said, congruent. And the differences are really fun to try to bring out, actually. So I'll leave off there.
Okay. So first of all, I would say, yeah, I really resonate, and I agree that this is supplemental or complementary to what I've argued. In the book I mentioned earlier on heaven, I actually have a chapter where I talk about universalism and how every Christian ought to be a hopeful universalist.
Hmm.
So we ought to hope that everybody is ultimately restored to God in Christ. There's definitely agreement there. I do have thoughts, questions. So first of all, my first one that comes to mind now is I'm thinking about three different categories of doctrine because in a sense, what we're asking is, well, how do we orient ourselves to this religion constituted by doctrines that you are expected to believe? And you're saying we'll shift over to hope rather than to believe. So my thought is, first of all, it seems like at first blush there are three basic categories of doctrine with respect to hope. There are ones that it makes sense that we would be oriented to hope. So I hope God is perfectly loving, all powerful, merciful, and that there is a joyous afterlife. And then it seems like there are doctrines to my mind that are more a matter of indifference with respect to hope. Like, is God ultimately a Trinity? I mean, could I hope God is a Trinity? What if God is actually four persons, or what if God is a monad? Um, or the filioque, right? Should I think the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son? I can kind of think of all the sorts of things that undetermined, to my mind, a hopeful orientation. And then there are doctrines which you kind of alluded to by saying some versions of the Christian story you hope are true.
Yeah.
There are doctrines that you should hope against, and there's a wide variety. Like I think everybody or most people agree, eternal kinds of torment. You shouldn't hope that's the case. What about meticulous providence? I hear often, this sort of living in a celestial North Korea styled
Mhm.
objection.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering about that. And conversely, like a person could say, the problem then is if everything's oriented on hope, you're in danger of creating a religion in your own image
Mhm.
much more. And if you are kind of forcing yourself to orient yourself to the doctrines that you are in a sense repulsed by even, or maybe you just don't really want to be true, maybe that becomes like a piece of sandpaper and sanding you and conforming you more fully to God's image by not just focusing on the things you hope to be true, but the things that you just have to bite the bullet on. I'm just,
Mhm. Yeah.
what are your
Yeah.
thoughts?
Those are some great questions there, I think. Some of those are perhaps exactly the questions to ask if you are considering this view. The the initially hard to swallow doctrines. Let's talk about that first. So, yeah, that's interesting. I can see that as a danger. Maybe, so that makes me think, okay, that's a danger. Is that an inevitable cliff you're going to fall off of? Well, hopefully not, hopefully. Um, so maybe the thing to think is like, well, what are some wise practices that can ward off that danger? And maybe one is just to retain a sense that you're actually not an infallible judge of what things are truly hope-worthy and truly beautiful. And maybe you should be open to revising your value, your sort of evaluative stance based on what you encounter in that tradition. But nevertheless, there will have to be something that initially can get its hooks in your heart and sort of draw you in. And then as you're journeying down the path, you see this doctrine over here. You say, wait, that doesn't seem obviously beautiful to me. It seems a little bit repugnant. Like, do I want God to know everything I'm doing all the time? A complete invasion of privacy. Um, and then you might have to stop and sit with that and think through that. As far as the invasion of privacy goes, you're absolutely right that there's so in philosophy of religion, I'm sure you have some listeners who are interested in the philosophy of religion. I think the most important development in recent decades is the rise of the so-called axiology of theism. The axiology of theism asks the question not should you think there's a God, but should you want there to be a God? Where maybe that you're an atheist, but you still really regret that there's not a God, and you find this to be sorrowful and a despairing thought. Or maybe you're an atheist and you find it to be liberating. Like Nietzsche, after he declares that God is dead, he also says there has never been such a free generation as ours. Finally, our horizon is open, like our ship is free. We can sail these waters unencumbered. So, should the thought of God's non existence give you a bracing sense of newfound freedom, or should it be something to lament and to dread? And that's what the axiology of theism asks. You can immediately see that this is relevant to this hopeful project, which my colleague Dan Speak calls hopeagetics. Uh, so I don't know if that term will catch on. I think of it as hope-based apologetics, but um, you can see that's immediately relevant because if hope is rational, then it must be the hoped for prospect is genuinely desirable. And it might and this opens up a project of thinking about what might some of the downsides be if the Christian story turns out to be true. And then you'll want to wrestle through those downsides. And are those things that should genuinely make us not want it to be true, or are they things that just initially seem bad, but actually it's not so bad, at least relative to the alternative prospects we might hope for? What you say about doctrines that are just sort of neutral, I think this is really interesting. I'm sure we could find some doctrines that are neutral, like when you said the filioque. Yeah, I guess I'd have to really think through in what sense we should want that to be true. But I understand the core sort of abstract doctrines of Christianity to be Trinity, incarnation, atonement, where the incarnation will just have to be understood in particular historical terms in terms of Jesus, not just that someone incarnated God, but Jesus Christ. And so I have another book planned, sort of tentatively calling it Faith for Questing Doubters. It's inspired by Alfred Lord Tennyson, his poem In Memoriam. I don't Have you read that, Randall? It's an
Yeah,
incredible
years
meditation.
ago, I did a English degree in the 90s.
Oh,
That's
you
about
did?
when I read it. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Oh, I'd be curious what you'd say if you picked it up again.
Mm.
It's an incredible meditation on doubt and grief and suffering, and the will to cling to some kind of faith in the midst of those doubts. And Tennyson presents this as a kind of heroic feat. Like the doubter is someone who's like slaying, as he clings to faith, he's like slaying various specters of the mind. And so he's like this kind of heroic questing doubter. Um, and So I like the idea of a faith for questing doubters. And I want a section that talks about the beauty of the Trinity, the beauty of the atonement, the beauty of the incarnation. So I actually think there are reasons to want those things to be true. It turns out, if I'm right about that, those are also a priori considerations in favor of thinking they're true. So that's kind of an interesting double payoff. But just,
Trying to
yeah,
interject. Um,
yeah,
so we have this distinction between, roughly speaking, dogma and non-essential doctrine, and
yes.
then adiaphoron, so matters of indifference. And typically, like those are identified with respect to understanding the centrality within the Christian story in some sense. So, doctrine of the Trinity is typically considered dogma, it's essential. But if I'm thinking about um, evaluating these on a hope scale, even if there is some degree of hope that the doctrine of the Trinity is correct, it's nowhere near, I would think, equivalent to hoping universal restoration is correct.
Mhm.
So that on that scale, the doctrine of the Trinity, even though it's considered dogma, is up here, universal restoration is down here as possible to hold, but definitely not dogma. But when you flip on the scale of hope, the scale is reversed. Now it's this one that you should have the maximal hope in. And if that's your conviction center, hope rather than belief, now that's up there. And the Trinity, even if you have some degree of hope in it, it's still much lower than
Mhm.
universal restoration. So it kind of inverts the prioritization of traditional
Yeah,
assent to dogma.
yeah. That seems like a really interesting observation. Yeah, so I guess if you're trying to think through how to respond, your options are to either say, no, the Trinity is actually that good,
Yeah.
or try to explain why that's not such a bad thing. But I see the worry there. You might want to maintain a kind of pride of place for Trinitarian doctrine, for the Trinitarian creed, rather than allowing that to be replaced by eschatological hopes. I wonder if that bears out, though, in the life of the ordinary believer, even, right? Because don't you get the sense that a lot of ordinary believers don't? Like, I was a modalist on accident for a long time. And I even, like, that only changed towards the end of my PhD in philosophy. So it might be that the ordinary believer doesn't even understand that, but they do understand being drawn in by the eschatological hope of seeing their little girl again, or even seeing their dog again, and so on. I suppose that's all to say. I wonder how bad that really is. Maybe that's just already the situation in the church.
Yeah, maybe they're just measuring different things. And so it's one thing to measure the relative doctrinal significance within the system. It's another thing to measure the orientation of hope, and it's just not a big deal that they don't match up to one another. I'm not sure.
Hmm. Yeah.
Okay, the big question about rationality. This is for a lot of people, I'm sure, bubbling underneath the surface. And I'll give an illustration. So I'm thinking a story I read in the media a couple of years ago, online dating, an older lady, lonely. She meets a prince overseas and he needs her just to send a little bit of money and then he can fly and he can be with her forever. And then he needs a little bit more money. And after 6 months or a year, she had liquidated all her retirement savings and sent him like $300,000 worth of her assets. But she still hoped, and her whole family is saying, "Yeah, but that is an irrational hope that has destroyed your life." So, at what point does the irrationality or counter evidence kick in and override the hope?
Yeah. This is an important question, and it's really hard to answer it precisely because I can come up with some cases like that one where the odds of some prospect are so low that it does seem, we almost want to say deluded. We might not say that to the person, but we might be thinking it. It might be true. That to hope for that thing in any kind of serious way is deluded. On the other hand, sometimes we do hope against hope, and it's not only may we, but we must. And the case of that would be like the parent whose child is dying of a sickness and they undergo an experimental procedure. Let's say the odds of it healing the child are 10%. Okay, so that's pretty low. Should the parent hope that the child will recover? To my mind, it's like not only may they hope, they must hope. Like if you're that parent and you say, I mean, if you're in that situation, I'm not really judging you at all. But if I were that parent and I deferred hope because I didn't want to say open myself up to the wounding that might be possible if that hope doesn't bear out, that doesn't seem to me. It seems understandable but not admirable. Um, and then now ask yourself, how low could the odds go? Seems to me 5% chance of recovery. It's still, at least you may hope. 1%? I don't know how low the odds need to go. Like at some point, it's time to start making funeral arrangements, I suppose. But for a time, holding out hope seems to make sense, even when those odds get really low. So it's an interesting question. When are the odds too low for hope to be rational? One thing that might be relevant here is just what is at stake and what your alternatives are to having that hope. So like the woman in your example, I mean, she chose to hope in this thing, but she might have had a lot of alternative hopes that would have been just as good or maybe better, that she could have wrapped her life around, right? Whereas the parent who has the sick child, like this is really the one great thing in front of him to be giving his attention to. So it may be that what's at stake and what your alternatives are is going to be the relevant thing there.
Okay. Calvinists and Arminians. I'm interested in your thoughts on this because there's a fundamentally different orientation I typically find in terms of their understanding of autonomy and free will. And some Calvinists say, well, there's no such thing as free will. I think typically the ones that are more cautious, of course, there are fatalist, terminist Calvinists as well, but I think most of them are more compatibilists and say, well, no, free will is a value, but it's this kind of compatible free will. So you have that, and then the Calvinist says, look, the biggest thing is whether God is glorified maximally. So
Mhm.
I'm wondering if hope is a guide, or if it's all just sort of person relative as to what kind of free will you ought to hope for, or whether you ought to hope God is glorified maximally, irrespective of whether that means the restoration of all creatures or not. Any thoughts on how hope would kind of map onto those different areas?
Yeah, sort of existing, long-standing theological disputes like
Hmm.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because so I've had this discussion with Calvinists. I am not a Calvinist, and I've made the case to them that it's actually not rational to have Calvinist faith because it wouldn't be rational to want it to be true. And faith is only rational if it makes sense to want the faith object, the faith proposition to be true. So I think this is actually a challenge to Calvinism. Now, my Calvinist friends, or this is us around the fire pit, they respond that they're deeply skeptical of our ability to judge what's genuinely good and genuinely hope worthy. So they're thinking there's some way in which most people suffering everlastingly because of the foreordaining of God's providence. Some way in which that's actually really good. We just don't see it. And if we could see it from God's point of view, we would rejoice in it. So that's how the, okay. I see how someone who's already a Calvinist could make that defensive maneuver. I I struggle to see how the spiritually curious agnostic could be drawn into that from the outside. Does that make sense? So I guess there's one thought about that. I mean, if you're a spiritually curious agnostic, I don't see why you're not hoping for universalism. The only obstacle to that philosophically is what about the free will of God's creatures and his respect for them? Does he love them enough to let them walk away? Okay, but you could still hope they all don't walk away, that eventually they turn around. So I'm curious what do you think about that? Does that sound right to you?
Well, I guess it's just to keep in mind that the main orientation of this hope model is framed it as apologetics, not as a systematic theological explanation for everything. So while you could run it through these various scenarios, the biggest question maybe is, does it get people in the door, right?
Hmm.
People who
Yeah.
have that initial, does it help them to participate in some form of Christian life, some understanding of the Christian story? And if it does that, then maybe it's doing enough for its
Hmm.
purposes.
Yeah, maybe. So Randall, do you think there's any role for the question, well, what should we hope to fill out a theological system?
Well, this is one of the things I'm thinking about. So I'm going to come back and maybe let's say my final thought to throw back to you
Hmm.
is like, if hope is where we start. So I'm wondering, okay, I can see how a person can say, I hope there is a loving God. I hope there is an afterlife of joy where we're all restored and so on and have a fullness of life forever, something like that. But how do I get beyond that? So I'm kind of back to some of the issues we talked about earlier. How do I get beyond that to like just why not just be a benevolent, hopeful deist, let's
Hmm.
say, or why not just adopt like this seems like this underdetermines adopting one or another Christian story. Yes, if you are a Christian, maybe it makes sense to hope the Trinity is true in some sense. But if you're that doubter, that agnostic, how do you ever get beyond just a sort of hopeful, benevolent theism to something more concretely and recognizably Christian?
Yeah, where, you could, okay, I'm hoping there's some God who sets things right, and I want to be part of a religious community. Am I going to go to a mosque or a church or a synagogue? Let me just like spin the wheel of fortune and okay, I guess I'll go to the mosque. And is that how this ends up working? Well, in on the ground, of course, it doesn't because people get drawn in through friendships. You know someone who invites you to church, and then you say, okay, this is a thing I've been hoping. Maybe I can explore this a little bit. And then you like the church, you find the liturgy engaging, and you like the people you meet, and they're friendly, and they don't seem like, uh, well, we won't get political, but and so you say, I could picture myself being part of this community, and then you come back, and of course, because we're in America, this is going to be a Christian church probably. Um, so that's how I kind of see it working on the ground. Now, someone who's in the Middle East listening to this might be drawn, give them a way back into the mosque or to retain their place in the mosque. And I suppose that's right. I guess I really am taken by the beauty of some of those core doctrines. I find the beauty of those to be quite significant indeed. And I really like meditating on like how is the world a more enchanted place if the Trinity, the Incarnation, the Atonement are true. And I think there are powerful things to say there. I mean, we could get into them. Obviously, that's going to be a big can of worms. We could spend a whole conversation on even one of those. But at the same time, can I register one thought with you, which is that in a way, I'm the reason this doesn't completely bother me is that I'm inclined to think a lot of people. So I think Christianity is the uniquely true religion in its creeds, but I am inclined to think that Aslan is on the move, and you can believe a bunch of false creeds about him and still encounter the one true living God. So I'm wide open to the thought that my Muslim friends, my Jewish friends, the the theist who's not going to any church is still encountering the living God in his life, who after all is at work redemptively in the lives of all his creatures. So that's one thought about that.
Okay, so like yeah, like C.S. Lewis talking about the fellow Emmett who worshipped Tash, that the
Precisely.
worship
Yeah.
to Tash was accepted as unto Aslan.
Yeah.
Okay, so I've often heard this objection to Alvin Plantinga's as a properly basic account of belief. Well, that applies to not just Christianity, but to any religion. And I've always been like, yeah, I mean, you can have a properly basic account of belief and proper functionalism in a Mormon account or a Muslim account. That's really neither here nor there. That account underdetermines it's not yet warranted Christian belief. It's just a general account. And it sounds like this account of hope, similarly, yeah, it can apply to various different religious systems. Doesn't That's not a knock against it. You
Mhm.
also, from a Christian perspective, believe Christianity is true, and there is something uniquely desirous in the specific Christian doctrines.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So the desirability part, I'm not someone who thinks there's just no evidence for Christian theism. I think there's some good arguments. Do I understand why it leaves some people in doubt? I certainly do. Um, so there's some role for an interaction between arguments for specific Christian creeds and teachings and arguments that those things are also beautiful and hope worthy. And I think that interaction can be a really powerful thing. So I do think there are a priori considerations for those that for Trinity, incarnation, and atonement. The historical argument for the resurrection, that's not bad when you have a bunch of other background beliefs in place, like that there's a God who's likely to reveal himself. Okay, then that historical argument becomes more interesting. Maybe moves you like that. So
Can I ask
yeah, I think that's
one
yep,
more thing before we conclude?
yeah.
People talk about Christianity, it is described as the good news. Having said that, the heart of Christianity is, in a sense, the life of discipleship. Take up your cross daily and follow me.
Hmm.
Ought one to hope that is the case?
Hmm.
I'm not a big fan of self-sacrifice, personally.
Yeah, should you hope that that you will need in your Christian life that you will need to take up the cross and follow me? I think that might be one of the sandpaper doctrines that you mentioned. Like at first that doesn't sound good. Who wants to take up your cross where that means to carry it to the mountain where you're going to be crucified, right? Is it not the case that as you live the Christian life, this is not a guarantee, and it's not a guarantee at all points in the Christian life, but that as you live the Christian life, there are various ways you can suffer and various sacrifices you can make, and that in that suffering you have ways of encountering God, or hoping that at least in uh, God is somehow going to be faithful to me in the midst of that, and that's going to be worth it in the end. But an interesting I see the challenge though. Suppose you're just saying, hey, I'm just going to hope for a benevolent theism. Why would I then go hope for this Christianity thing that says like discipleship's all hard and stuff? I think that's a good, I'll have to really think about that. Yeah, that's a good question.
Well, I hope you come up with a great answer.
Well, thank you. Hey, Randall, can I say one thing about your book before we end?
Sure, of course.
I, one thing I love about this book is that if you are someone who is within the church doubting or exploring Christianity as a doubter, one thing I love about this, and I'm not quite sure how you did it, but I get the sense that if I were in that position, this book would make me feel seen and understood and welcomed. And I think that that probably just pervades the writing because that really is your heart in this matter. And so I would just commend this book to anyone who is in that position and wanting to be seen and understood and welcome. So
I really appreciate that, Brian. And I also appreciate you joining us and just
yeah,
having a wonderful, hopeful conversation. And we'll definitely do it again. So thank you very
yeah,
much.
very good. Thanks, Randall.